Hello and what is up YouTube? My name is Chieftain and welcome to the long-awaited, much-anticipated 316 Scourge League Starter recommendations. Today, our discussion, we're going to feature 4 different builds for a couple different approaches for how you might be thinking about playing in the upcoming 316 Scourge League. So whether you want something new that uses new gems and maybe a new playstyle that you haven't used before, or if you want something that's tried and true, old and faithful, good, reliable starter, well, we've got options for you across the board. Also, for the first time today, we're going to be trying something different. We're going to try and predict a little bit of the meta for league starters. We've never done that before prior to a league start, and so we're going to do that at the end of the discussion today. So if you've got predictions, you can feel free to leave them down below in the comments. Don't forget, if you enjoyed today's discussion, make sure you like, subscribe, and ding the bell to be notified about future video discussions about the 316 Scourge League. Usually we do economic discussions as well as gameplay, game development discussions, along with maybe some meta snapshot overview discussions. It just depends on how things go throughout the league for other discussions, but that's the bulk of what we do around here. For those of you who would like to league start with something new, then I recommend trying out the latest brew from the alchemical labs of Grinding Gear Games, Poisonous Concoction. Poisonous Concoction is related to a previous skill gem, Explosive Concoction, but hopefully it's not as an explosive dumpster fire as its predecessor. While Explosive Concoction isn't really anything special to write home about, its newest iteration of the poisonous variety may turn out to light up the entire league. Both skills are somewhat similar to playing with a trap-based style or self-cast AoE spell builds. Here are 3 reasons why, if you want to try something new, you should consider Poisonous Concoction as the new thing for you this league. First off, GGG has redone the entire passive tree. So with an entire overarching reset on the passive tree, it's got some favorable looking nodes and some favorable looking leanings for builds that utilize chaos damage. Poisonous Concoction does that, so there you go. We've checked off one reason. Second, Flask mastery changes have made it so that way sustaining a Flask-based damage-dealing skill to be a little bit smoother in gameplay for 316 as opposed to 315. And the third reason, while Explosive Concoction really scaled around both Ignite, but mostly on hit effects, what we're doing with Poisonous Concoction allows for a particular damage source, let's say a boss, to have its damage ramped up as you are engaging with it. In other words, if it doesn't get deleted right away, your damage is going to continue to scale throughout the duration of the fight, and whatever it was that you were fighting a second ago is eventually going to go down. You don't need to worry about your damage dropping off. Your damage essentially wraps up the longer the fight goes. That's kind of the way how poison skills work in Path of Exile, and Poisonous Concoction is looking like it's going to take advantage of that. So on either side of my slightly balding forehead, there are 2 different approaches for how you could start something new here with Poisonous Concoction. You can go with either an Occultist version or a Pathfinder version. And of course, there are links to the path of buildings down below in the video description. If you want to mess around with either one, there are advantages to playing this in either way. There's advantages to going either Pathfinder with your flasks or Occultist with your various chaos manipulations, such as nearby enemies having reduced chaos resistance. Be aware that whether you choose Occultist or a Pathfinder, you're going to need to level up using whatever skill you're comfortable with until you can actually begin to ramp up that Poisonous Concoction effectiveness with your flasks. It'll be a bit different in terms of playstyle because you're really looking for your flasks to augment and to help your damage. So it's a new archetype, it's a new gem, and if you've never played around with anything like this before, i.e. with Explosive Concoction, it'll be new for you. And if you even have played with Explosive Concoction, this is most likely going to be better. Doesn't necessarily mean it'll be good, but it'll be something new. And so if that's what you're looking for, this is what I recommend. Before we talk about tried and true starters, I've got 2 of them to suggest to you in just a moment. Let's talk about a very real possible scenario. Let's pretend it's your second day of the league and your league starter didn't quite work out. You tried real hard, but it just isn't fun. You're not progressing, and for whatever reason, you're stuck. The only reason why you're here chatting or listening on YouTube and hanging out is because you're looking for alternative builds that you could potentially pivot towards. There's good news. You can pivot and potentially use similar gear to what you've already got without having to re-roll an entire character and essentially restart your league over. Recognize right away from the get-go that you can pre-plan for what you can pivot to prior to the second day of the league and your league starter not working out. You can pre-plan what you might pivot towards before that actual failed experience has occurred for you. So here's a couple of things that you can do to actually plan your pivot. First off, if it is day 2 of the league, if the league has actually started and you've realized that, hey, your starter was a mistake, you don't enjoy it, or there's a progression wall that you don't want to push past for whatever reason, you can simply be a sheep and follow the leader. You can check out POE Ninja, see who's progressing fastest on the hardcore solo self-found Scourge League ladder. You can take a look at what ascendancies are at the top of the charts for your character that you've already selected. That would save you time from re-rolling an entire character. You can also look for what skills are dominating the charts. Do any of those particular ascendancies or skills look appealing to you? That can give you a guideline. It can give you really a railroad track to follow to actually get your league start back on track from where you were a few moments ago, off the rails and frustrated. You might be wondering why I would suggest to check out on the hardcore solo self-found ladder and not whatever other league you're playing in, whether that's a trade league or solo self-found yourself. Well, there's a couple of different reasons. First off, no one likes dying in Path of Exile. I don't care if you're a hardcore player or a softcore player, no one enjoys that experience. So by taking a look at what the fastest and most dedicated players are achieving in hardcore solo self-found, you're going to be able to look at a build that has got layers of defenses to prevent itself from dying. And so while you might not be inclined to take all of those defensive mechanics that are there, you can at least maybe learn something from some of the defensive mechanics that are being used by those players who are pushing the hardcore solo self-found ladder. Another reason to look at the solo self-found side of that ladder, not just the hardcore solo self-found side of that ladder, is because if you're looking at Trade League POE Ninja, a lot of those players who are at the top leaderboards are being fed by guilds and by other players and by groups. In other words, players are pushing for lots and lots of experience, lots and lots of new thresholds, and racing and rushing and doing all sorts of amazing things with the help of groups. Chances are, if you need to pivot, it's not because your group isn't feeding you enough stuff. It's because you're playing on your own and you don't have a group feeding you stuff. So rather than looking and creating a false expectation for where you should be, looking on the trade ladder, go look at hardcore solo self-found and see what it is that players on their own, through their own crafting, their own skill, and their own lucky drops, what they're able to do and what sort of builds they're able to shape and progress with on the hardcore solo self-found ladder. Besides looking at the hardcore solo self-found ladder on POE Ninja, the other thing that you can do, that's more like, hey, if it's day 2 and you're looking backwards. If it's today and you're looking forward and the league hasn't dropped yet, have alternatives ready. Don't just look at the league starter, the one league starter that you want to play. Have a couple of other league starters potentially available to you. This is one of the reasons why I try to recommend a variety of different league starters. It's not just because I want to have lots of different recommendations. It's because I want to have pivot options that I'm going to play, and I might as well share some of those pivot options with all of the rest of you as a community. For instance, I have 2 other builds besides my main selected league starter build planned for each character class that I'm going to play. So for me, I've got a witch build that I'm planning on playing as a league starter. I then have 2 other witch builds that I could potentially pivot towards. I've got a ranger build that I've got planned out as a league starter. I've got 2 other ranger builds that I could pivot to if my original one doesn't pan out. And then I've got a duelist build that I'm looking at, and I've got 2 others that I could pivot to if my original one doesn't work out. I've pre-planned my league start so that way if I need to pivot, I'm not going to be wasting time once the league has actually started. After all, once the league starts, we all want to be killing monsters, not killing time, looking for what other builds we should pivot to. So maybe you're not interested in playing something that is new. Maybe you want something that is tried and true no matter what. It's proved reliable over the ages in Path of Exile. Well, here's 2 options for you. 1 is going to be a Detonate Dead Necromancer. 2 is going to be an Ancestral Warchief Chieftain. Both Volatile Dead and Detonate Dead are both fantastic options for players who want to be able to preload their damage for Izaro popping up, or for bosses in a map, or maybe even for Scourge encounters. The explosions that are going to be set off by your Detonate Dead and Volatile Dead are slightly taxing on your computer, so be aware of that. Consider yourself warned. The thing that I like about this particular build and POB by Smurfey is the scaling damage of Ignite and how that's going to relate to the scaling content that we take on as our character progresses. So here's the way that Smurfey writes about it in the guide. Many boss fights contain monster pools that have many low HP monsters. Non-Ignite Detonate Dead builds will have a bloat of these monsters in their desecrates, resulting in very low average damage compared to the max potential damage. With Ignite, we completely negate this downside to the skill. Only the highest Ignite will be dealing damage. So if we detonate 12 corpses and one of them is our desired Spectre, we will deal full DPS for the duration of that Ignite. Later on in the guide, Smurfey continues to write this. With Ignite being increased from 50% of base damage scaling to 125%, we will make great use of that base to scale some awesome numbers. All right, that's the end of Smurfey's write-up. It's a pretty clever way of scaling and messing around with the new Ignite changes on an old, faithful, reliable build. Maybe you're not interested in dealing spell damage. Maybe you want to hit something really, really hard, or more appropriately, watch something else hit something really, really hard. If that's what you're interested in, then this particular build by guggelhupf is going to be the build for you. It is not John Cena's music. It is, in fact, guggelhupf's music as he brings in, along with him, a whole bunch of totem boys to slap down some slappy Scourge bosses throughout 3.1.6. Maybe you hate having to be rooted in place to cast spells or deal damage or do attacks. Maybe you hate losing your mobility when you're in a particular encounter and you want to be able to dodge dots on the ground or dodge various abilities that are coming at you. Well, by maintaining your damage through totems, you yourself can maintain mobility to deal with all that the rest of Path of Exile and Rayclast is throwing at you. While you're playing through the 10-act story campaign, you can drop a totem. It's going to clear out whatever pact it was that was close to it, and you can keep running. It's not going to be a fast build. Don't hear what I'm not saying. This is not a fast build, but it will get you through the 10-act story campaign with relative ease, and it'll get you into maps taking on bosses where there are much better drops and much better currency to be earned, especially early on in a league. Some of you out there might be scratching your head saying, well, Iron, why are you recommending a build that uses Facebreaker? I mean, isn't Facebreaker a unique? Well, if you look over and you notice, I've pulled up POE Antiquary. I've ticked all the boxes for the last year worth of leagues, and you can see on that tiny, tiny little chart, Facebreaker's prices are at its highest for the last league on day one, and on average, the price is 2C. So yeah, you can spend a minute farming a zone, grab a couple of jewelers, a couple of fusings, convert those over into chaos, and bada boom, bada bing, you got your Facebreaker and away you go. Path of Exile in 2021 is not Path of Exile in 2018. We've got more drops, more monsters, and more uniques that are available to us than ever before. There is zero excuse not to use a League starter build that has got an incredibly, historically cheap, unique item that is available early on in the game, and that will scale you into the late game of your League starter build. Last thing I've got to say about this Chieftain build is simply that it's a Chieftain build, and a lot of players are very excited about the passive tree rework and the passive tree reset for 3.1.6 and the ability to stack attributes. Chieftain is one of those very nice, helpful ascendancies for stacking attributes, and so if anybody would like to, I don't know, take a League starter and transition it into a very high budget, high investment, attribute stacking monster of a build towards the mid to end league, well, there's an option for you, and it saves you having to rerun the campaign in order to play your end of budget or end of league character. Both of these builds have got guides and path of building linked down below in the video description. I've given you my recommendations for League starters. I've got a bunch of POBs pulled up. I've got all of my pivots ready. Hopefully you've got all of your pivots ready. And now I want to ask the question, well, what's the meta going to look like in the 3.1.6 Scourge League? And I feel like this is actually something that we do a pretty darn good job of here at Good Guy Gaming. And there's not a lot of other discussion hosts and discussion channels that really do this inside of Path of Exile, which is simply to make predictions and make observations about what is going on and what potentially could be going on. There's a ton of people who are numbers crunchers and theory crafters and a ton of other wonderful information sources inside the community. But I feel like one of the things that we do is we kind of take a step back and go, okay, what is going on just presently inside Path of Exile? And then we try to make some observations based off that. So let's do that right here with what the pre-league meta looks like, at least for recommending build guides. What I've got pulled up here is a bunch of thumbnails simply from searching on the most popular videos in the category searching for Path of Exile builds for 3.1.6 Scourge. You can look up here. There's probably a bunch of thumbnails that you're going to recognize from probably a bunch of videos that you've been watching over the last week. Included in these videos, Just a few of the builds are Holy Relic Guardian, Vortex Cold Snap Occultist, Death Aura and Caustic Arrow Occultist, Ice Crash Inquisitor, also Righteous Fire Inquisitor, General's Cry Shield Charge Berserker, Corrupting Fever Tornado Shot Gladiator, Physical Trapper Saboteur. That's actually getting a lot of hits on a lot of different videos. Ignite Armageddon Brand Elementalist, Shield Crush Slayer, Volatile Dead, Spark, Elemental Hit, Bane Occultist, Scourge Arrow, Toxic Rain Champion, Spellslinger, whatever version of it, and Freezing Pulse Totems. That seems to be like the top 15 to 20 or so recommended different builds that are floating around out there. And there's a couple of things that are missing, actually, in the 3.1.6 meta discussion. For instance, right now, not a whole lot of people, at least in terms of the YouTube population, are looking at minions, for instance. Minions aren't necessarily in the top ranking or top discussion portions, which as a minion player always makes me smile, because it means my items, if I go that way, will be cheaper. But there's other archetypes as well that aren't necessarily being touted or promoted. For instance, Cyclone isn't necessarily in the top rankings or top promotions of anybody in particular, and Cyclone with Impale still should be pretty good. It was decent in 3.1.4, decent in 3.1.5, even after the nerfs to damage, and it'll probably be decent again in 3.1.6. Anyway, these are just some observations as to what's going on in the Path of Exile community at the moment. There's a whole bunch of different recommended builds going on out there, but I'm sure you can fill in a couple more of the blanks. There are some pretty serious archetypes which have proved to be reliable over the last year or so that are not necessarily getting recommended right now. So what will be the meta? Feel free to drop a comment down below. I think at least the League Start meta, you could probably say, I'm going to guess it's going to be somewhere in between Champion along with something off of Ranger. I don't think Deadeye's going to be up there, but Pathfinder for sure will be up there early League. And then on top of that, probably some mixture of either Occultist or Inquisitor. Those are just some guesses that I'm throwing out there. We will certainly look back after the first week of the league and take a look at what actually turned out to be the League Starter meta. We usually do that about 6 to 7 days within the league just to take a look at what players ended up choosing for their first build of the league. Thanks so much for joining us for today's discussion. I'd love to hear down below in the comments what build you're going to be using as you League Start and what predictions you have for the League Start meta. I've made my predictions. I've shared with you a couple of my ideas, but I would love to hear yours down below. As always, thanks once again for watching and participating in our community, and I hope that 3.1.6 Scourge League is the league that a Mirror of Calandra, or maybe even one of those tainted ones, drops for you. If you'd like any more information about the topics we chatted about today, links are provided down below in the video description. The G3 community has grown a ton over the last several years, and that's thanks to viewers like you and faithful Patreon supporters. Big shout out to longtime supporters and first-time supporters for this month.